If you're not a patron yet, head over to patreon.com/EricMalikyte. Link is in the description, where I published 1 to 2 short stories a month in the genres of cosmic horror, dark fantasy, cyberpunk, and dark science fiction. The first 4 stories are free to read, so you can get a feel for my work. And Into the Astral Lands, the story that shares the same name of this podcast, is also available on Amazon Kindle, Smashwords, Apple iBooks, and Barnes & Noble for free. The next story is going to be exclusive to patrons, and you can get access to it by pledging as little as $1 today. You'll also get this podcast a week early, and at higher reward tiers, you'll also get early access to short stories and rough drafts as well as artwork. Welcome to another Into the Astral Lands podcast. I'm your host, Eric Malikyte, and today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. So there is no topic this week. I'm going to be reading from Into the Astral Lands, the short story that shares the name of this podcast, that was the inspiration for this podcast, and I hope this will be fun. I'm going to divide this up into multiple parts, so for the next couple of weeks I'm going to be reading this story. So yeah, I imagine that since it's only about 7,000 words or so, it shouldn't take more than a few episodes to get through. I'll divide it up into different sections or something. Now, I'm going to be reading from the Amazon Kindle version of the story, which has been updated with some grammatical fixes and things like that. So if you want, that's over on Amazon.com for free, and it's also available on Smashwords, Barnes & Noble, and Apple iBooks if you'd like to read along, or if you'd just like to read the story. It's not very long. Anyways, let's go ahead and get into it. Into the Astral Lands by Eric Malikyte. Who are you? Adam asked. Why do I keep coming here? The man tilted his head. There was always something off about him. It wasn't just the fact that it was hard to tell what he looked like in the dark here. The only detail he could see was the smooth acrylic mask that became visible when the man shifted position, a thing which almost never happened. There was a strange pressure that Adam felt when staring in his eyes, into what he assumed were the man's eyes. For weeks, he'd been dragged here in his sleep, his soul snatched up from his body and carried off to God knows where. At first, he wrote the experience off as a mere nightmare that he couldn't shake, but dreams disappear. They ebb. The memory from this place, and he knew somewhere deep inside himself that it was a place as real as any other, never faded. It infected every aspect of his waking day. When he stared up at Earth's blue sky, he could almost trace the outlines of that massive thing whose tentacles seemed to radiate out of an eclipsed dying star. The corona bled out from the edges of some other body that blocked its light, and illuminated faint hints of its impossibly massive twisting tentacles that blocked out the stars of alien worlds and distant galaxies. They covered the entire sky, as if they, whatever they were, and whatever they belonged to, constricted around the planet he now found himself standing on, if it was a planet at all. No matter how many times he asked, the man never answered his questions. He only stood there, staring through and into him. Perhaps he was studying Adam, waiting for the right moment to speak. It was pure madness sometimes, to stand there, staring endlessly at the man's silhouette. He dared only to look away for moments at a time, each time to study his surroundings. He found it strange how the land seemed barren, like pictures he'd seen of the moon. There were strange obelisks with jagged and fragmented surfaces that reflected the eclipsed star's light. They seemed to sprout out from the earth, covered in a strange inky substance that clawed through the dusty surface like roots of some dying plant or tree. Sometimes, if he stared too long at one of those obelisks, he'd see teeth and eyes staring back at him, and he'd shudder, feeling a piece of his sanity peel away, never to be reclaimed. Something always compelled him to look back at the man's face. The man always kept his limbs hidden beneath some kind of long, draping cloth or coat that stretched past his feet, resting on the earth with fraying and torn edges. The cries of a dying child echoed through that terrible place, twisting and wrenching at his heart. The masked man did not move. And eventually, the nightmare would end. The weight of heavy bags dragged Adam's eyes open. It was still dark outside. The ceiling fan was turning slowly, making that nearly inaudible grinding noise that was almost soothing in the stillness of the night. He had 3 hours until his alarm clock went off. Lilith's cries pierced through the paper-thin walls from the other room. Part of him wasn't sure if he was really awake. There was a silent fear inside him, As if when he entered his daughter's room and carelessly glanced at the night sky through her bedroom window, he'd see that same eclipsed star and those twisting tentacles, writhing, clawing, grasping until they covered the entirety of the earth. He was having a hard time telling reality from that other place lately. His wife rolled over and nudged him. "Baby, I'm knackered," Sophia said. "It's your turn to feed her." She rolled back over and yanked the comforter off of him. He sighed and rubbed the bags beneath his eyes. No, this was not that other place. He was sure of that now. He stood up, feeling the weight of his tired, middle-aged bones, the flesh that seemed to hang on his skeleton as if draped on a coat rack, and walked into his screaming daughter's bedroom. Her cries threatened to rupture his eardrums as he cradled her in his arms. Holding her didn't ease her anymore, not since the nightmare started. Maybe she knew. Adam picked up the bottle with Lilith's formula in it. He placed it near her mouth, the way Sophia had told him to. She started to suckle on the bottle's nipple and quieted down. She'd start up again as soon as she had her fill, though. With the silence came a persistent buzzing in his ears. Or perhaps it was at the back of his brain. It was almost hard to recall the first time he held her in his arms. How bright the fire burned within him. Now there were only embers. He stood there, holding his daughter, staring at the night sky. Maybe it was his imagination, but it almost looked like something was moving in the darkness. "Oi! What the hell, Adam?" Sophia stormed into the room, snatching screaming Lilith and the bottle from his arms. The harsh, piercing beeps from Adam's alarm cut through the walls and arrested her senses. The sun was out now. Sunburst rays cut through the foliage of the tree outside Lilith's bedroom window. Adam's eyes blinked for a moment as if he didn't know where he was. "What the fuck were you doing? Sleeping standing up?" she shouted. "It's bad enough what you said to my dad last night. This is absolutely mental." "I need to get ready," he said robotically, walking out of Lilith's room with stiff movements like his legs were asleep. How long had he been like that? She set Lilith down in her crib and followed him into the bedroom, where he was slowly putting his trousers on, staring at the vanity mirror with a detached look in his eyes. She'd seen that look before, and it filled her with such indignation for him. Would he be so irresponsible? "I swear down, Adam, if you're hitting the pipe again, it's out on the fucking street you go." He barely registered that she was there. He pulled his trousers up, buckled his belt, and slipped a dress shirt on, buttoning it as he dragged his feet into the bathroom. The door was locked. She banged on it, hoping for an answer, anything. "Oi! Don't ignore me, you fucker!" Her mother always warned her about American men. Adam sat at his cubicle, staring into the black mirror of his computer screen. The screen had turned itself off to save power. He was tempted to leave it off. The harsh light from it made his brain hurt lately. But if he did that, his boss would yell at him. He hadn't made a single sale all week, and his coworkers were already giving him sideways looks. He rubbed his eyes. He couldn't remember when the screen blinked out. Couldn't recall how long he'd been staring into it like that. "Adam?" The rough, sandpaper quality of Mr. Trent's voice caught his attention. He turned around in his seat. "I need to see you for a moment." Adam stood up. His legs felt weak, his head light. Maybe he was coming down with something. Yeah, that was a good excuse. He'd use that. He entered his boss's office. The cologne Mr. Trent used to mask his body odor permeated the air, almost made Adam gag as he took a seat in front of the desk where his boss sat. Each time the man breathed, it was as if the very act of sitting was physically taxing. Trent was a fat man, but he always specified that he liked the term big and tall at office parties. Adam hated parties, especially ones where Mr. Trent was present. Sophia once referred to him in her own special way as an arse-licker. Mr. Trent kept his desk rather barren, except for the occasional box of takeout from the Chinese food place across the street. The box of noodles and meat sat open, its pungent odors mixing unevenly with his boss's cologne and body odor. Trent interrupted his favorite thing in the world for this. That couldn't be good. "What's this all about?" Adam asked, trying to sound attentive, as though he hadn't just been caught staring into a black screen for God knows how long. Mr. Trent sucked his teeth. "You know what this is about. Don't play stupid, Adam. I've been coming down with something. I know I haven't made a sale all week, but a lack of sales for the week is hardly your biggest problem today. That mess you made in the break room has Ellen threatening to go to HR. She thinks you're some kind of Satanist." "Satanist?" He blinked. "I don't understand." "I always heard that you went to church, so I didn't want to believe it myself, but..." Mr. Trent lumbered, stood up, and placed a photo in front of Adam. "We took pictures, and we've got video from the security tape of you doing it too, so don't try to say you didn't. Proof's in the pudding, as my grandma always said. His heart battered his ribcage as he held the photo in his hands, staring at the strange, demonic symbols that had been drawn out on the whiteboard. His writing hand itched, throbbed like it had been asleep. "The look on your face says it all," Mr. Trent said, waggling his chins as he nodded. He could feel the blood drain from his face as if harvested from the proboscis of some parasite that had latched onto his neck. Adam recognized those symbols. How could he have missed doing something like that? "Well," Mr. Trent asked, "do you have anything to say for yourself?" He remembered staring at the fresh list of leads in his email, and how his eyelids had felt heavy, how it'd be so good to close them, rest them for a bit. He remembered closing them. And then he remembered that other place. How he had stood staring at the man with the dirty acrylic mask. The memory was so powerful that he could almost feel the dry, freezing air of that other place burning his skin as he sat in his boss's office. "Why am I here again?" he asked the masked man. The man turned and looked to the eclipsed star. The dim, eerie light from the escaping corona revealed an elegant carved smile in the man's mask. The mask looked ancient, as if it were forged by a god long since dead. The light also illuminated his tattered hood and draping cobweb-covered cloak. It seemed to have the texture of rotted flesh. His eyes were whole, and there was only darkness in them. But when Adam stared into those eye holes, he felt that familiar pressure. The masked man raised 3 gnarled, blackened fingers, bidding him to follow him somewhere with a slow, almost meticulous come-hither motion. "Come, Moscow. This place. The spider's strength grows." "I don't understand." The masked man turned and started to walk away. Adam felt compelled to follow him, and so he did. The cloak dragged along the dusty earth. The frayed edges were almost like claws raking lines in the dirt. The billowing cloak was mesmerizing to Adam. He almost didn't notice the shifting landscape, the way the scenery seemed to change around them as they marched forward. An occasional glance to the sky made him shudder. Those impossibly massive tendrils that radiated out from the eclipsed star looked almost like the walls of a tunnel, and then they were the walls of a tunnel, slick with muck and slime. The eclipsed star seemed to have been replaced by a dim light at the end of the tunnel. There was a whistling sound with a sick, damp feeling that clung to his skin. It filled him with trepidation. "Where are we going?" Adam asked. The masked man did not answer. Adam's footsteps echoed and reverberated off of the slick, mucky walls of the cavern. The tunnel never seemed to end, no matter how far they seemed to walk. The light never grew. Adam was focused on the back of the masked man's head, the slight shifts in position it made as he inched his way forward through the tunnel. And then, as if traversing a doorway, everything was different again. Now they were up to their knees in swaying tall grass. The grass was the color of blood. It made clicking sounds when 2 or more blades touched. The sky was something else. It had the texture of a ruinous ancient structure. There were thousands of support pillars silhouetted against the only light source for miles. It radiated out from a central structure, above a spiral staircase that cascaded down from a doorway the shape of an open maw. "Come," the masked man said. "In there?" Adam asked, fear chopping his words into jagged bits. The masked man walked forward, and Adam followed despite his trepidation, despite the gnawing, panicked feeling that he should turn tail and run for his life. His feet dragged, almost as though they resisted the hypnotic urge to follow unceasingly, which his body could not. The dragging feeling persisted, even as they entered the mouth door and assailed blackened steps with strange symbols in them. And then, something tugged at his foot. "What the?" Adam turned, looking at his feet. They were covered in some kind of ink, a black sludge that seemed to grip at his ankle like tiny fingers clutching at a cliffside. It was like the stuff that came from the jagged obelisk, from the place they had just been. The masked man turned his head, looking at Adam's feet, but it was too late. The ink tendrils yanked at Adam's leg, and he fell flat on his belly, knocking the wind right out of him. The next thing he remembered, he was being slapped in the face by blades of razor-sharp grass. The masked man was running after him one moment, and then the next, Adam's body was carving a trench in that disgusting tunnel. And then, he could have sworn that the man's mask had a frown carved in its surface, an elegant sign of displeasure. "Are you listening to me, Adam?" Mr. Trent said. Adam snapped back to reality. He gave his boss a jerky nod. "Jeez Louise, you're useless." Trent sighed heavily. "We can't have someone like you wasting our customers' time and offending productive employees. I'm sorry, Adam, but I'm going to have to let you go." Adam nodded. He wasn't even disappointed. "Collect your things. Get out of my sight," Trent said. Adam stood up. The memory from that other place was still clear in his mind. It was as if he was in two places at once. He had been lying on his side in the dirt, the reflective blackened surface of one of those obelisks rubbed against his skin, cutting at his very essence as roots of ink wrapped his body, climbing into his mouth. He remembered choking on them, feeling a sensation like the crawling legs of thousands of cockroaches making their way down his esophagus. The last thing he remembered before waking up in his office chair was the sight of an open maw with razor-sharp, rotted teeth banging against the wall of the obelisk. He remembered being afraid. He didn't want to be eaten by the mouths of that thing. The masked man came running to his aid. He dragged him away from the obelisk and ripped the inky tendrils from his mouth and limbs. But it was too late. He went for the door. Then he stopped. A sudden knowing fell upon him, a thing which escaped his lips with a will of its own. "Oraseth is coming." The words were uttered in a low, guttural tone that was not his own. When he heard them, he knew that this was what the message said in the photograph. He felt another part of his sanity peel away, felt it drift away like flower petals in spring, carried by the winds of chaos. Trent's eyes glassed over when he heard them spoken. His lips quivered and twisted into a frown. He reached his twitching hands up, started to claw at his face with his fat, stubby fingers. He started to scream and hyperventilate. His boss's final words were an incoherent mess of panicked nonsense. He was searching with his hands for something, feeling the desk, knocking the open box of Chinese food onto the floor with a clumsy swipe of his arm, then the floor, and finally the window. Found its safety latch, popped it, and out his fat body went as if grabbed by the eager hands of gravity itself. Adam was found standing at the window, peering down at the splattered mess that Mr. Trent's body made on the pavement below. Trent was smiling, and so was he. All right, I think we're going to stop there today. That's part one of probably two of me reading Into the Astral Lands. So yeah, if you like this podcast, go ahead and smash that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe. Ring that bell because YouTube is stupid, and I will see you next time on Into the Astral Lands podcast.